The Disneyland theme parks like to promote themselves as the happiest place on Earth. And while that may be the case for some people, we've all heard the stories about cover-ups and people being killed or mutilated due to malfunctioning rides. Deep down, people know the risks, but they choose to roll the dice anyway, thinking that they'll be safe and that nothing will happen to them. Well, I wouldn't be too sure about that. So put on your Mickey Mouse hat, and let's begin. Number 1. Back in the summer of 2011, I was practically dragged kicking and screaming to Florida with my extended family to visit Disney World in Orlando. At the time, I was in my 30s and very overweight, and I didn't like the idea of walking around such a massive theme park in the hot sun, spending my hard-earned money on a mega corporation that makes billions of dollars for overpriced food and beverages. Needless to say, I was pretty bitter, but I was guilt-tripped into going by my siblings, all of whom wanted their kids to spend some time with their estranged uncle. I had hoped that they would be content with me remaining in the air-conditioned hotel bar, but my grade school-aged nieces and nephews didn't want me out of their sight, and tugged at my fingers, dragging me all over the park to show me pretty much anything that waved or sparkled. There were 8 of them altogether, their ages ranging from 14 to 3, and while I'm fine with kids in small doses, if it weren't for the fact that their parents were my ride, I'm pretty sure I would have abandoned them in the park. After over an hour of marching around and sweating my ass off, and constantly having to find places to refill my water bottle, I couldn't manage to fake it anymore. I had been smiling and chuckling for the benefit of the kids, but inside I was screaming. I just wanted to sit down and stay put for a while, instead of marching all over the Magic Kingdom and trying to take it in all at once. To make matters worse, those guys in the mascot costumes kept coming over to me, seeing me with such a large group of kids, and always wanting to high-five me or hug me or something. I finally explained to the small group of parents that I needed to take a break, and unless they wanted me to start smoking in front of their kids, they would need to give me some space for a while. I know that kind of makes me sound like a terrible person, and normally back home I was very agreeable and never cursed or lit up in front of the kids, but everyone has their limits, and I was at my breaking point. I walked for a short while away from the big attractions, and found a semi-quiet space near a security office to sit down on a bench and have a smoke, which may or may not have been allowed. I didn't care. I noticed a little way off to my left in a kind of alcove, another one of those mascot guys apparently was chilling out, sitting on a low stone wall by a fountain. I didn't know they were allowed to take breaks while in costume. I didn't recognize the character, but it was hideous. It was some giant shark-looking creature, who I assumed to be something out of Fantasia or something. I've since discovered that it was an alien creature from Lilo and Stitch, called Captain Gantu. I watched the poor guy in the mascot costume probably sweltering in that outfit as he continued just to sit there, barely moving, maybe twitching his hand every once in a while. I figured perhaps he had fallen asleep. I finished my cigarette, polished off my water, and sat there for a while longer, just enjoying the view, still watching the character out of the corner of my eye. A few other people wandered by, but almost everyone was either on their phones or looking at the scenery, and almost no one gave a second glance to either myself or the mascot figure. After maybe 25 minutes had gone by, I stood up and stretched. I noticed one of the security guards walking towards me. I figured he was heading into the office, and I started to say, "Hey, you better check out that guy over there." But the guard just nodded and cut me off, and continued past me, saying that he was about to do so, and asked me to move along. Had he not asked me to move along, I probably would have done just that. But the urgency in his voice made me curious, and I paused to watch from a distance as the security guard walked over, nudged the enormous costume bulk of a guy, and then tried shaking him. The guy mumbled something into the radio, and continued to try to get a response out of the man. I took a couple of steps closer to get a better look. The man in the costume hunched forward off the wall, and a red liquid of some kind, I'm not sure if it was blood or vomit, began to trickle out of the opening under the mask and splashed against the sidewalk beneath him. The security guard said something loudly into his radio, a numbered code of some kind, and spread out the mascot as best as he could while he was on his back on the ground, before cutting open what had to have been a very expensive costume with a knife from his belt. A very foul stench hit me just like a frying pan to the face, a putrid, sickly chemical smell. I backed away a bit and watched as the security guard tried to resuscitate the man. I never saw his face, only the top of his head, which had thinning gray hair. After about 6 or 7 minutes, paramedics and security guards sprinted past me. One security guard physically grabbed my arm and pulled me away, while another 2 guards raised a sheet to block the sight from the public. I thought at any moment I would hear emergency sirens or some kind of alarm. But as I wandered back through the tourists in a confused daze, I just watched the people going about their vacation having fun, as if nothing was happening. I tried to stop and look back, but more security arrived and firmly continued to lead me away, explaining that I had to clear the area, but stating it in a very hushed, reserved tone, so as not to alarm anyone else within earshot. I honestly don't remember saying much of anything, except hollowly asking a few times, "What happened? Is the guy alright?" After I found my family again, none of them seemed to notice my shell-shocked look. After another half hour, a man in a suit with a Mickey Mouse tie walked up to me out of nowhere, shook my hand, and told me that I had been randomly selected for exclusive promotions throughout the park, including accommodations at a few restaurants, and front row seats at a few shows, including tons of toys for the kids. My family went crazy with excitement and hugged me as if I made their dreams come true, while I began to feel even more sick inside. I'm still not sure what exactly happened to the poor old man in the costume. There was never any news about an emergency or death at the park that I could find, and while I've told several dozen people about this since, this is the first time I've ever put it online. Disney may appear to be the happiest place on earth, but they know how to cover up horrific occurrences extremely quickly and make bodies disappear with minimal effort, and that terrifies me.
Number 2.
Earlier this summer, my sister and I had an opportunity to visit Walt Disney World in Florida, compliments of my job. I brought my teenage daughter Teresa, and my sister brought her son Josh, who unfortunately has Down syndrome. My sister, being the sentimental and caring person she is, made sure our first stop was to visit the spot where the young boy had been killed by the alligator, and last June to leave a flower and pay her respects. Teresa and Josh waited nearby as my sister said a few words, and we had a moment of silence for the poor boy. Then we made our way back. We thanked Teresa for watching Josh, and told them that we can now wander freely throughout the park. Teresa said that Josh had been very eager to follow the man with the red hand. I glanced around for a moment before asking my daughter what exactly she meant by that. She was clearly annoyed and shrugged, staring at her phone as she answered without answering that there had been some guy wearing a top hat and waving at Josh, and he had a red hand or glove or something. Her vagueness didn't fill me with much confidence, but you parents out there who have teenage kids know the feeling. That description didn't seem to match any Disney mascot character I was aware of. Figuring that Josh had said something that got lost in translation, we went one way with Josh while Teresa played the independence card and wandered off on her own. About an hour had passed of us mostly just walking around and taking loads of pictures of Josh with various Disney characters when we stopped to get a bite to eat and talked about what to do next. My sister got a phone call from her husband, and I was taking in the scenery, enjoying the view and watching all the young families walking by, when I caught a faint smell that didn't seem to fit in with where we were. It reminded me of a very cluttered garage, with oil splattered across the floor, and rusty cars being fixed, and just a hint of tobacco. Curious to see if anyone else had noticed the smell, I turned my head to look over at my nephew, and discovered he was no longer sitting next to me. I stood up and turned my head in all directions. Suddenly frantic, I slapped the table to get my sister's attention, and asked her where Josh was. Immediately my sister hung up the phone and started calling for him. I stepped away from the table and walked across the sidewalk, and that's when I saw him. And I understand how this is going to sound, but a very tall man wearing a top hat and a baggy coat had Josh by the hand and was half jogging, half walking him away from us. I screamed Josh's name and ran towards him, and when he heard his name being called, he turned, and the tall man did as well. He was wearing a pair of those extremely creepy Japanese Matsuda sunglasses and had a pointed face with a sharp chin. He immediately let go of Josh's hand and started power walking away through the crowd. Most people didn't look twice at him. I guess because it was Disney World, and there was lots of crazy characters walking around. I grabbed Josh and hugged him, and my sister was on the both of us in an instant. A few people approached us and asked us if we were okay, but I was too shaken to even speak. I couldn't even find the words to explain to the people surrounding us what the potential kidnapper looked like. I stood up and looked down the sidewalk and spotted the top hat wearing man in the distance. He was looking back towards me. I pointed directly at him and yelled, "Him there!" The man raised his right hand, except it wasn't exactly a hand. It didn't even look like a glove. It was a grotesque, elongated red claw. The man smirked and pointed to his back pocket with his claw, and then disappeared into the crowd. A few people called for security, and I just stood there in shock, convinced that I was having some kind of fever dream, and that this couldn't be happening. Meanwhile, Josh was laughing the whole time, as if this was some kind of game. We eventually found Teresa and spoke to park security. I didn't know if the strange man had been a tourist or an employee. I could not figure out if he had been dressed that way for any particular reason, because again, he didn't seem to resemble any Disney character that I knew about. They kept asking me if the red claw was a prop or his real hand. I said a prop because that made more sense. We left our contact information with the security office and left the park. When we were back in the hotel, I was going through my pockets when I found a note in the back pocket of my jeans. It was a scribbled handwritten note that smelled musty like tobacco in a garage. It read,
He'll be fine. Number 3.
I'm 16, and last year my 6-year-old cousin and I were wandering through one of the gift shops in Disneyland, looking for something special to take home as a souvenir from the trip. I was flipping through a section with posters when my cousin came running up to me, holding a stuffed, very well-known snowman character, but immediately something struck me as being very wrong. My cousin gleefully held it up and said, "Look, I found a red one." Instead of its normal white, the doll was heavily stained with red splotches all over. I coaxed it out of my cousin's hands, and immediately my stomach dropped. It was sticky to the touch. "Where did you find this?" I spat out frantically. My cousin pulled the snowman back and squeezed it against her shirt, producing red droplets trickling down from the doll all over her shoes. "I found it back there in the room with the sleeping man." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What room?" My cousin pointed to the stockroom door at the end of the aisle. I carefully made my way towards it, a little voice in my head scolding me for being crazy, that it possibly couldn't be what I was assuming it was. I gently pushed open the door, and it stopped short. It was being blocked by the leg of a fallen man. There was a pool of blood on the floor, and a fallen stepladder by his knees, and I noticed a white shard of bone sticking upwards out of his sleeve. An overturned box had scattered stuffed toys all across the floor, and most were making contact with the blood. The man groaned in pain. It was hard to see everything with the door slightly cracked, but further back into the room, I noticed that the lights were all turned off. I could make out a dark figure standing at the far end of the room. As soon as I noticed the figure, I was paralyzed with fear. The person then stepped out into the light, and what I saw, I will never forget as long as I live. The person was in all black, but was wearing one of those vintage Mickey Mouse masks, those soulless cartoon eyes, and that menacing open mouth smile was making its way towards me. From behind the mask, the person spoke in a chilling Mickey Mouse voice.
Hi there!
I shrieked and slammed the door shut. I then pulled the doll away from my cousin, grabbed her, and marched her out of the store. A few people gave us some sideways looks, with our hands and clothes stained red, but no one stopped us. I took her to the nearest bathroom, washed her hands, arms, and clothes as best I could. She kept whining about how she didn't want to leave. I explained on the fly that the doll belonged to the sleeping man, and if he woke up to find it missing, he would get very mad. She seemed to buy that. I know what you're thinking. Why didn't I tell someone? I didn't tell my parents, an employee, no one. I was in panic mode. And there was a voice in my head screaming the whole time, "Don't get involved." Looking back now, I regret that decision. I made an irresponsible and cruel decision, and I feel like I'm a terrible person. I have no idea if the masked man was responsible for injuring the employee of the gift shop, or if it was just some nutcase hiding out in the storage room. All I know is I can never look at a snowman character, or honestly any Disney toy, the same ever again.
There's always a reason to be afraid.